Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Memory in a Time of Pandemic. In this series of videos, we talk with the world's leading memory experts about the ways in which the COVID pandemic is shaping our individual and collective remembering and forgetting. What will they personally remember from this time? What insights from their work in their fields will help us to understand memory both during the pandemic and later of the pandemic? Will COVID change the ways in which we are studying memory? This series is sponsored by Memory, Mind and Media, a new interdisciplinary journal launching this year from Cambridge University Press. I'm Amanda Barnier from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, founding co-editor of the journal alongside my colleague and friend Andrew Hoskins from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. In this episode, I'm in conversation with Professor Ira Hyman from Western Washington University in Bellington, Washington, about an hour north of Seattle in the US. Ira is Professor of Psychology and the author of an incredibly popular blog published on Psychology Today. For our Hamilton fans out there, his latest post asks, "Who tells our stories?" Ira is best known for his work on the creation of false childhood memories, memories for flashbulbs and traumatic events, eyewitness memory and collaborative memory. He's the co-editor or co-author with Ulrich Nieser of a classic book, Memory Observed, Remembering in Natural Context, and an important advocate for ecological validity in memory studies, understanding memory in the world and in the wild. Welcome, Ira.
Thanks, Amanda. It's really nice to be here with you. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing Memory, Mind, and Media out, so that's going to be kind of fun to have happen too.
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be, we've got an amazing roundup of experts such as yourself and lots of others from all different disciplines. So lots of great voices. So my first question, just sort of to jump off, is when did these COVID times start for you? What's your sort of first memorable memory?
It was a bit of a gradual buildup for us. In part, our location, which you noted, is really crucial here since we're in Bellingham, Washington. Just a little over an hour from where the first COVID or some of the first COVID cases in the U.S. were found outside of Seattle. And so early on, it was clear that COVID was loose in the U.S. and loose nearby and spreading without awareness in the general population. So even early in February, as those reports were coming out, my university was starting to send out emails warning us that things could get bad and to look for us to potentially start to move online. That if cases were found in our local community or at our university, that we would expect to go online. And so it was always close. And actually, I have family. One of my sons is in Seattle. And so we were tracking the cases and we regularly went to Seattle. I was in Seattle a couple of different times during February, and a couple of times pretty close to where some of those first cases were found. So it was sort of a gradual buildup in awareness, and then in early March of 2020, during the last week of our classes for that academic term, on the Tuesday evening, they had 2 cases found associated with our university. And so late on Tuesday, literally at like 10 o'clock at night, I happened to check my email and had an email from the president of the university that we were going online. Boom. And so I was supposed to be teaching class the next day.
Right.
And I went in and did my first class on Zoom. My first lecture on Zoom, which I flailed at, and we managed to get done. And I managed to get final projects in and grade final papers. But yeah, so there's a bit of a flashbulb of opening that email late at night, right? Just, sitting in our chairs and checking my email, before I was going to, turn off all the electronics and just read for the evening. And seeing that email and telling my wife, who was sitting next to me, and, there might have been some curse words come out of my mouth. Choice words, because they were not sure how much risk the university community as a whole had been exposed to. So yeah, those were my first memories. And then I had already been really aware. I had a mom. My mom died in this last year. We will probably touch on that at some point. and she lived in an assisted care facility. She had Alzheimer's, and we were already at the point of, even for a couple weeks ahead of that, when I would go visit her, that I was washing my hands religiously and was not hugging my mom when I would see her, or getting within 6 feet of my mom when I would see her, already at that point. So, I mean, there had been, dramatic changes, and within a day or so, the care facility closed its doors. So that was it was a tough time. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like, you're really active on Twitter as well. And so you've shared your experiences as well as in your blog, and obviously through the community, your local community and the broader community. So is it your intuition that it sort of, depending on where people are, you describe really a sort of a more gradual onset, whereas some other people I've spoken to seem to have a sort of very definite, this day, it came out of nowhere this day. But your sort of sense of awareness of what was going on, is that there was good information sharing that was going on in your local community, in your university, compared to other places where it seemed to come out of the blue and had more of that sort of flashbulb nature to it, which is all of a sudden life changed?
Yeah, no, it wasn't a sudden life change for us because, and again, for some parts of the U.S., the cases were far away, and it felt like they were far away. Whereas one of the first outbreaks in the U.S. was at a care facility in and around the Seattle area. And some of the first cases discovered were accidentally, well, not so accidentally, they were discovered through their sort of routine sampling for flu in the Seattle area, where somebody at the University of Washington, and their facility down there, started testing for COVID, even though they didn't have permission to do so.
I remember.
Yeah, so there was a lot of information, and my university was really transparent. We were getting an email every day, about what our plans were, and I was supposed to be hosting our small regional conference, our Northwest Cognition and Memory Conference, which we've done, for over 20 years, and it was my year to host at my university. And Steve Lindsay, who's one of the organizers, and a couple other people, we were emailing back and forth even before anything closed, starting to talk about what our plans would be if things closed. And pretty shortly after that, before my university even said we were going online for the next academic term, we canceled and postponed. So it was a gradual for me. There's some memories in there of a lot of those events, but there's not one that's like, this is the moment where it started, right? And I would venture to say, when we talk about flashbulb memories, some of the errors in flashbulb memories where people are wrong about something are sometimes, Bill Brewer called them time slice errors, where you might not be consistent in your story, but you may be grabbing another bit of something about that time period, because there's a lot that happens in there. And so for some of these people who are like, yep, this was the moment, I'm willing to bet there were some things that built up to it.
Right.
And that there were other moments afterwards as well, for all of us in these things.
So do you think that, there's a large literature that you've helped to contribute to and lead around flashbulb memories, that the sort of lessons from flashbulb memories about sort of what sorts of things stick and what don't, and how they are shaped over time, and how they are communicated through communities, that some of those same lessons from that research will apply? And what things do you think will be quite different, because this is such an extended event and such a global event, even with its sort of national and local sort of nuances?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to try and do some flashbulb memories here, right? I didn't think to collect any of those at the start, so we won't be able to say, to do the comparisons. I'm hoping somebody has that data, but I think that in part, I feel for a lot of people this was a much more gradual thing. It wasn't a single moment, where things dramatically shifted. Even before the university closed down, it was pretty clear that things were going south. And so, I had done some grocery shopping in anticipation that we might be home for a few weeks. A few weeks, right?
A few years later.
it's that sort of stuff, right? And so there are bits and pieces in there, you know, and so there are these standout moments,
right?
And there are various, probably for all of us, are going to be standout moments in this process. You know, that emails from my university president saying we were shutting down, it's a big deal. My first, you know, Zoom failure class, you know, I mean, it worked, but it wasn't brilliant. Yeah. But I had 12 hours to get ready. So,
yeah,
you know, I'll cut myself a little slack.
Absolutely.
You know? And there are going to be some other standout moments in there. You know, the moment of getting my first vaccination. Right. That's on the positive side, right? So there are bits and pieces that are standout moments, but I think the flashbulb stuff, the trauma stuff plays into it, but it feels a little bit different to me because it was a more gradual buildup, even if we have these moments that are really critical.
So do you think it's going to tell us something new and interesting about sort of the relationship between sort of episodic memories and sort of more general episodic or autobiographical periods? I mean, because a lot of us, you know, perhaps you in the US more than us in Australia have had a lot of sort of probably mundane elements as well, sort of days in lockdown. So Australia hasn't had as long a period of lockdown. And when I spoke with Robin Fivush earlier, and she talked a lot about being in this room, in this library for a really long period of time and the same thing sort of happening. And I guess as autobiographical memory researchers, we often focus on sort of discrete autobiographical episodes as opposed to the repeated general events. What do you think is going to tell us about the relationship between those two kinds of things?
I think that this is going to be really informative about that. So I started a diary study on myself as a good memory researcher just at the time that we were shutting down. And I have been recording 2 events a day for a year and some now. And I probably will start testing my memory sometime in the next month or 2.
Okay.
I'm going to force my wife to pull these things out, and I've got a plan for how to test memory.
Yeah.
And as I'm doing this, you know, I went back and reread some of Marigold Linton's work on diary memory studies, and she did some brilliant work on this. And I've done diary studies before where you have people record things every day, and then at some point later on, you do some recall or cued recall and recognition memory tasks. And when I've done this with students in a class, one of the things that they will say to you after recording diary entries for even just a week is they will say, I didn't realize how boring my life was.
Right. Yeah.
You know,
Did they mean mundane or repetitive or?
Yeah, all of that, right? So it's a little bit mundane. It's a lot repetitive. And they were trying to pick out 2 or 3 things a day that they would be able to remember later on.
Right. Right.
And you know I found that to be the case too. And Marigold Linton says that most of her sort of losses in memories are because of the schematization of memory.
Right.
That this event no longer stands out because there have been multiples of this event.
Yeah.
Now afterwards. And so, you know, I might have like my first Zoom class, but how many Zoom classes have I had now?
Right.
My first Zoom lab meeting, and how many Zoom lab meetings have I had? My first Zoom conference, and how many Zoom conferences have we had now?
It's exactly. So what do you think sort of media will play in this? Because, you know, I keep sort of hopping back to Twitter only because I follow you on Twitter and I love to, you know, read your commentary there. And I mean, in a sense, that's also acted as a diary, hasn't it? I wonder, will you also sort of, because you've shared photos there, and I guess I wonder about if diaries are writing, what other images do you think have been important in this time that stand out for you? You know, might you also sort of ask your wife to pick out some Twitter entries and or show some images and say, when was this from? Or what was happening here? Because I guess in a sense that's been as evocative as sort of a narration of your sort of your time, you know, your life during this period that might capture a different element to your written diary entries.
Yeah. So for people who decide they want to follow me on Twitter, I'm relatively, I don't know, I think of myself as relatively boring, but, you know, I will post about cognitive psychology and a lot of stuff you'll find on disinformation in the last year.
Absolutely.
But I post dog pictures. You know, we have a cute puppy. And I gripe about bicycling from time to time. and those sorts of things there, and a lot of stuff on U.S. elections over the last year. What I think is that this is going to be one of like Norman Brown's time periods, right? And there's going to be a before COVID, and there'll hopefully at some point really be a true post-COVID time period. I find myself thinking a lot about Michael Ross's implicit theories of change and consistency when I think about this. We're going to rewrite the past. We always rewrite the past. And it's a construction. And some of it will have to do with where we see things have changed. And the COVID time period is itself a changed time period. And so we're going to look back as before COVID, and we're going to see some. I suspect a lot of people are going to see some glorious past in the before times, and we'll make it better than it was then, because we will think that things got worse. I think we're going to rewrite our COVID memories the same sort of way. That COVID time period, for some people, is going to become worse than it actually was. Because they're going to remember it in negative light, and now things are better, and I'm going to make the past worse than it actually was. And in looking at those sorts of things. But I also think that what will come with this is that we will change our understanding of what our roles were in some fashion, right? So if I think that being in isolation and wearing my mask was important, I'm going to think that I adopted those things earlier than I actually did. And if I'm going to think, that those things were stupid, there's a lot of people in the States who feel that way. We're going to, say earlier how soon we bought into Trump's lies. How early we thought that way, right? And we're going to push it back and make those things more important. And so my thought here is that, sort of there's this schematization and how similar our lives are, which is going to make the time period itself a bit of a blur. And it's hard to find individuating events when everything takes place on a computer screen, like our lovely conversation. But then we're also going to be rewriting that past, potentially glorifying the pre-times and potentially making this more extreme than it may have been. And it's been freaking extreme for most of us, right? It's been a horror after a horror in some ways, an anxiety moment after an anxiety moment.
It's been because it's been a global event, but it's also had these sort of national and local flavors and individual flavors, hasn't it? That, as I've said before, Australia did pretty well in community transmission, and but has, some of the most vivid images for me are watching on TV of sort of the digging of mass graves in, outside New York or in other places, or what's going on right now in India. And so it's sort of everybody's experiencing it, but there's going to be this interesting nuance. And I guess as cognitive psychologists, we look for group effects, don't we? But we're also really interested in the individual things that are happening underneath. And that will be a challenge. Perhaps cross-cultural sorts of elements have to come in here, or sort of different elements of, people's background or socioeconomic circumstances. So that's going to be more complex. Do you think it'll change the way as researchers we go about doing our memory work?
Well, that's a really nice insight, Amanda, because I think that you're right, that there's going to be some cultural effects here. And some of it is going to be the way that each culture handled it. And some of it will be how much we were exposed to mis and disinformation campaigns. And there have been a lot of them around COVID. The whole the vaccine hesitancy or denial, and the lies about vaccines, and how much we've been exposed to them in different groups. But I think some of it may play into sort of these cultural and family variables too, right? That how much do we talk about these things? And how do we talk about them? And will matter for these sorts of things. I mean, you've got better people you're talking to than me to talk about sort of some of the cultural stuff. I mean, Chi Wang will have interesting things to say there, but it seems to me that it might require us to think about these things. And even in the States, I imagine that we are going to have to talk about cultural issues here, although there'll be some of these things that are both political and cultural in terms of how people and groups of people responded to it. The mask wars and what are now going to be the vaccine wars.
Exactly. And we talk a lot in memory, don't we, about the relationship between sort of what we remember and our sort of sense of self. And I mentioned at the beginning in your latest blog post, and you talk about the musical Hamilton, and you quote the line, "Who tells your story?" And those who know Hamilton are fans of the musical will know that his wife Eliza, is the one who tells his story and stays alive for a really long time to make sure that he's sort of recognized. So can you give us a sort of little recap of your argument there? And in a sense, as we think through this relationship between the stories we'll tell and how we'll feel as a sense of ourselves, and how that will shape our individual and group identity.
Well, yeah, I mean, the individual and group identity are so important for how we remember, and then how we remember shapes those things. So that it's a nice little circular path when we're looking at memory and identity when we look at this. And any of us who are in any sort of social group knows that we don't always play the same roles when we remember, right? Families may have one person who gets to tell some parts of the story, Amanda, and somebody who tells different parts of the story. I know, I cited some of your work when I was talking about that aspect of it. And there's oftentimes, somebody who's a dominant narrator in certain circles. Bill Hurst talks about this, William Hurst does, and that person then sort of sets the agenda for it. Now, the nice thing about after collaborative remembering is that we adopt the version of the story that we heard there. And those things become our memories, is the version of the story that was told. We pick up information and now it becomes our memory. We think of it as our memory, not somebody else's memory. And then the interesting thing is that the things that don't get mentioned get less rehearsed, and so get lost in our memory and no longer become part of the memory. So that we are co-constructing our memories of the past. And each of us starts to adopt those memories going forward and thinks that they are our memories. So how are our families going to talk about these experiences? That's going to determine how we remember them later on when we're thinking about the COVID time period. And I don't know. It's the simple answer, right? And who gets to tell these stories as we go forward in terms of our groups? It will be interesting, in the U.S. We're just now starting to come back and see each other again, right? I'm not back in my university office yet, and it won't be for at least another month or two. But then I will start to see my colleagues in the hall instead of on video. And how will we tell our stories going forward about this time period? I don't know. Yeah,
it's really interesting to think about even sort of when will the conversational sort of when we started our conversation today, we sort of, we're comparing experiences and checking in and sort of, and that seems to me something that's really common, especially with people who are overseas and you haven't caught up, but even other people, in other states or wherever, that's sort of that conversational place. We're just going to get on the same page about where we've been. And you and I have met at conferences before, and I guess we catch up about things, but never in that sort of same way. Is it about, well, it's quite important that we just go through and share sort of, what our experiences have been like. It's sort of just a really interesting social sort of thing that we're all doing at the moment to say, it's been hard, hasn't it? And it's challenging. Oh my goodness. And like, how are you? Are you okay? And which seems to be serving a really important social function as well as a memory function.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the great things about like flashbulb memories, just to pull it back around to that. These are not flashbulb memories, but they are a shared experience, a widely shared experience. And that all of us have that shared experience. And I know that you have experienced something, and I know it's different than what I have experienced. And in part of this because you're an Australian, and part of this we're different. And the way in which we manage these things, and you still have younger children at home, and mine are grown, and all of these things matter. And so when I remember I had a friend who was in California in the Bay Area for the Loma Prieta earthquake there 30 years ago. Yeah. And it was a big earthquake, and people died, and freeways collapsed, and he told me his story, right? And I told him my story. He told me his story about how he felt it, and I told him my story about how I heard the news. But he also told me something interesting. He said within a couple of weeks, there were people selling T-shirts on the corner in San Francisco that said, "Do not tell me your earthquake story."
Right. Yeah.
That people got sick of those conversations too.
Yes.
I think we're still in the time period where we are reconnecting with people,
yes,
and having those conversations. But there may come a time period where we stop talking about them.
Yeah.
Survivors of traumatic things may choose to not talk about it for a period of time, or not talk about it to everyone. And even sort of, these shared horrific things, people may decide that we're done talking about this now. Or I may choose to not talk about this aspect of it. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so interesting because I think here in, Australia, our universities, we came back onto campus, not for lectures, but for practicals and tutorials. And, we've been back on campus for quite a while, working on our offices and things like that. We had a sort of staged reopening, but you're right. I mean, actually, thinking back, we've stopped having those conversations day to day here. When we first came back, it was like, oh my goodness, homeschooling nightmare. And, and what about, Zoom? And oh my goodness. But we've stopped those conversations now. We don't have them anymore. But, I do have them with people like yourself or people who are in the UK that we connect with. Just how are you going? Because that sort of time course is really interesting, that we've got things in common, but actually our time course is going to be interestingly different, which is probably something quite distinct than we've ever really, studied before, sort of same sort of event, but on a different time course.
Yeah. And we'll, even some of the people who I am regularly in touch with, via Zoom, and other places, some of them are my colleagues. We don't, at first it was a lot of discussion of, oh my God, how are you this week? And like half of the conversation was about, the horrors right now. Yeah. And now we're back to more or less work meetings.
Right.
Or other meetings, or, just checking in with friends and family.
Yeah.
But there's less, even before the vaccines, there a gradually decreasing part of the conversation was centered on, I'm freaking sick of this. Not, there was always that, but it kept shifting downward.
Yeah. So the need maybe, just shows us that memory isn't just for information exchange or learnings. It's about emotion regulation, isn't it? It's about emotion management together, or, so if we're actually doing okay, we're not exactly back where we were, but we're okay, then maybe that shifts. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And it's the bond building too, right? So, you and I haven't seen each other in a conference in a while. I can't even remember the last time I was at a...
I think since Cape Cod and, New York and Cape Cod and...
2 years ago. And so, it's been a couple of years since we've seen each other. And so, the start of our conversation needs to always be, how are we doing? What's been happening to you? How have you managed this? And so there's going to be a lot of those conversations to start. As part of our check-ins,
So living in history, again, back to Norman Brown's idea. We've talked quite a lot about what we're going to remember, and you also sort of mentioned about the things we perhaps won't say, the more sort of silenced or forgotten sort of things. What about misremembering? You kind of hinted at misinformation and disinformation campaigns. So we've talked about what we'll remember. What do you think we'll misremember from this time?
Well, again, I think the Michael Ross stuff will be rewriting to be consistent with our beliefs about what times were like. But I think that some of the misremembering, and this is going to be a very U.S.-centric perspective for just a second, but not completely there, right? Because there have been a ton of disinformation campaigns around COVID. Mm-hmm. And pretty much every right-wing authoritarian who is sharing information has been sharing sets of disinformation. And I'm sorry to be bluntly political about it, but I'm in conversation with a lot of disinformation scholars in very different fields, from cognitive psychology to computer science to journalism. And, we're having these ongoing conversations, and the worst sets of disinformation are routinely coming from right-wing, more authoritarian governments and political figures. So what does this mean? Well, it means there's both sort of a denial of the seriousness of it, denial of the number of the cases, a denial of how many deaths or how many long COVID cases there are, lots of denial of the seriousness of it, and a rejection of lots of public health information. And I think that we are going to see divergent memories then,
Right.
Somewhat broadly based on political perspectives,
Mm.
in a way that I'm not sure we've ever seen before, or at least that we haven't checked for before in our human memory work. That, and again, this comes back around to some of the identity things.
Yes.
That my identity is tied up with being this part of this group and this sort of a person with these sorts of values and beliefs, and that plays into where do I get my news and which information do I trust and who do I trust, and that's helping to rewrite my understanding of a lot of these experiences.
Yeah.
So I think that there's going to be some broad brush things that we'll be able to say that will be driven by some of these political narratives in a way that it's, you know, the social media component that we haven't had before.
Right, exactly. No, I think there's been work on sort of climate change and perhaps sort of vaccines, immunization in the past, but, you know, I suspect not as polarized, that those align with some political views as well, but probably to the extent that it's then going to impact on your own personal memories of information you've seen or what you've experienced will be, you know, quite a new phenomena for us to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, just like Maskware.
Yeah.
You know, are you wearing a mask routinely when you're, you know, shopping?
Yeah.
Or are you being a person who doesn't wear masks? What's the right word for that person, Amanda?
Wear masks, maybe. Yeah.
Right. You know, in the States where we still have a large number of cases on a daily basis, you know, it's like, yeah, if you're not wearing a mask, I have words for you, but they're not words I'm going to put on the recorded Zoom call here.
Yeah. Well, Australians are quite compliant, as it turns out. Compliant people, we like rules, and, you know, we won't cross the street mostly against the lights, and you know, people liked, I guess, mostly liked masks.
We're rugged individualists.
Well, we don't have that. We don't have that national narrative quite so much about. I was speaking with Charlie Stone recently, who's a scholar of sort of collaborative memory and collective memory, and he said that Americans have a collective memory of rugged individualism. And I said, that sounds quite funny in the sense of having a collective memory of being such individuals. But he said it explains a lot about the sort of the way, you know, the sort of those senses of memory. What role, you mentioned social media. What have you noticed about the role of media in sort of the memory building around COVID? Obviously in those sort of highly politicized kind of narratives and the reaction to masks and vaccines and, you know, what other things have you noticed, you know, in the role of the media in all of this?
You know, I'm not sure what's going to be the role of the media in this beyond the sort of disinformation campaigns that are playing into how we identify the sorts of behaviors that we then take on. But some of what strikes me about this as well, something we haven't touched on, and let's touch on this as well, is it's one of the things that are sort of the highlights in our lives, or at least big events in our lives, are shared collaborative group events, whether they are the celebratory events in our lives or the grieving moments in our lives. And something that has struck me about the COVID year plus now, year and a half, is the disruption of both of those things. You know, the number of, you know, we haven't had college graduations in the U.S. We haven't had live ones. We've been doing various things online. And, you know, I haven't been to a COVID, you know, online wedding yet. You know, but I know that people have been postponing a lot of things, a lot of celebratory things. And, but nonetheless, people have graduated high school. People have graduated college. People, you know, have done a lot of these sort of normally bring the family together and celebrate. I missed my niece's wedding You know, I had intended to travel to it well before, and it was on the calendar, and you know, I chose not to. When my mother died, we had a very small outdoor service in her honor, and my sister, who also lives near me and near where my mom was, insisted on at that moment sending my mom back to be buried next to my father on the other side of our country, and I didn't go for that, although she chose to travel for that. I will at some point go, and have, you know, sort of that completion of my grieving. But I think that these disruptions of these sort of normal big events in our lives and in our memories, these marks that we lay down, right? The when you talk about the sort of classic life events that David Rubin and Derek Berenson talk about, you know, these sort of cultural script moments, the disruption of all of these cultural scripts that has come in these, you know, 16 months now that we've been addressing this worldwide. I'm not sure how we're going to remember that disruption. You know, what will write in there? But I know that we will write something in our memories, and I'm just not sure what those will look like at this point. It's an interesting thing to think about.
It is, and it's really, you know, it demands a longitudinal study, doesn't it? You know, in 40 years' time or something, you know, when we're finishing off our memory work or something, that we look back and say, or for the kids who miss their graduation, or, you know, the university graduation, or those sort of big transitional marking moments from adolescence to young adulthood or something, to say, what impact did it have on the way they look back over their lives? And I don't know, maybe, you know, there must be work, for instance, from the World Wars, World War II, or, you know, I was reading recently when Prince Philip died, the Queen Elizabeth in England's husband, that, you know, she was married in a dress that was made from fabric that was bought with war tokens, you know. So if she was married, you know, I think maybe in the latter part or the early part of the war. And so there must be some our colleagues in other fields, history or sociology and media studies and war studies, who I guess might have some insights into that. So it'd be neat to work together to think about what have you seen in earlier generations of these kinds. But I was chatting to someone the other day who said it's interesting, actually to Robin, who said it's interesting how few memories there seem to be of the pandemic, the 1918 pandemic. In family stories, it's unusually absent. And we kind of wondered whether it was because that was right at the end of World War I, which had been so catastrophic. And maybe that's why the stories, it was just another insult to add on top of an already horrendous period of time. But I guess, you know, time will tell in a sense, but it'll be interesting to think how it will change what we know about memory now.
Yeah, I think these are interesting questions, right? About how we'll remember these sorts of things. I have lost the name of the authors right now, but there were some. There was at least a study done 40 years after, asking people who had been in some of the Nazi camps, and survived. Now I'm going to have to go look it up just to remember. And they had, I mean. So here you have this life that's repetitive and constantly traumatizing, and there's no escape, and there are really horrific moments within that. And, you know, they don't necessarily have memory for individual events, right? 40 years after, they've got the sort of the global thing, and but they misremember things, and they misidentify the people who did some of these things to them. You know, and they don't necessarily like to talk about it, right? I mean, even some of the survivors of, you know, Auschwitz and such, many of them only talked about it years later. You know, to talk about this. And so it doesn't surprise me that there aren't, and you know, I've seen the same thing, not stories of the 1919 pandemic. I'm wondering what the stories will be here, right? I mean, a lot of them are being written now. As people are on social media. So there are stories being written. But, you know, how will we talk about it in the after times?
Exactly. And what will be the commemoration? One of my the case studies I really like to think about is of a man named Andrew Nicky Barr, who was a World War II fighter pilot, an Australian serviceman, and he fought in World War II, and he flew P-40 Kitty Hawks out over Africa and all of these missions. He was shot down a number of times. He was in prisoner of war camps. He was married just before the war. He left his wife, Dorothy, at home. She was told he was missing in action on multiple occasions. He had a very, very challenging war, like many of our, servicemen and women. And he said he never spoke publicly, and he said even very rarely privately about the war for 50 years afterwards. Here in Australia, we commemorate those who've served in war like you do. We do it on the 25th of April on what we call Anzac Day. We have these commemorations in the last decade or so. There's been such an upswing as we've lost our World War II veterans. The last of them have passed away, and this, there's such an upswing in commemoration. But he said he didn't want to commemorate it. He didn't want to think about all the things he'd had to do to survive the things he wasn't proud of. So that kind of pull between sort of individual remembering and forgetting and what serves you versus this sort of broader cultural commemoration, I think will be interesting. Some of us have been fortunate, I think, and will survive COVID reasonably intact. Others have had great losses. Others have had catastrophic losses. So it'll be really interesting to think about how to meet those individual needs. And I guess those longer needs of what lessons will we learn from this period?
I think that there's an insight in there in what you were just saying about the difference between how we do commemorate wars. But there are lots of these sorts of tragedy, the culture that don't get commemorated or talked about. So this, maybe another pandemic that, how do you commemorate a pandemic? Yes. Who do you celebrate? Yes. When you can, you should celebrate, the food workers and the grocery workers who went on anyway. But
scientists who made the vaccine.
We don't do that. We celebrate the people who go out and, fight.
Right.
So, it's a different sort of thing to think about commemorating. And there are sets of things like that we're not particularly good at commemorating anywhere in our cultures. And so I think that may be part of why we don't see those stories, is because it's not the sort of story where there's a hero.
Yeah. Yes.
Where all we are is, at this point, we're survivors. And hopefully we'll make it all the way through, Amanda.
Right. Hopefully there's a redemptive arc for us all. So let me ask
wouldn't
you
that be lovely?
A final question, Ira. What do you think you'll remember most from this time?
Trying to gather myself for a second so I can do this. It's going to be the loss of my mom.
Yeah.
My mom was dying. Let me just be really clear with the people who might watch this. My mom had Alzheimer's. She was dying. She died of Alzheimer's. She did not die of COVID. They kept COVID out of her care facility, in part because they closed it down. But we had somebody from the family going to visit my mom almost every day, and getting her up and helping her move and keeping her moving. And so COVID led to her faster downfall than would have otherwise been the case. She was going to die. I knew that, but I had to watch my mom die over video calls, and I was unable to be there with her when she passed.
Yeah,
and that's a bit of loss that you don't get back.
Yeah.
And so, how will I remember this time period? The anxiety that I constantly experienced, I was fairly confident that if I caught COVID, I had a pretty good shot at getting through. But that if my mom caught COVID, we were done.
Yeah.
Because her health complications were such that was going to be it. And so the anxiety of, were they able to keep COVID out? How big was the risk for the first several months was overwhelming. And then just to watch her, downfall, quicken over COVID, and seeing her through these windows and occasionally through the window of her care facility,
Yeah.
And every now and then we got to meet outside there, distanced, but not very often. So it's that whole process that will stay with me, and my grief and my anger over it.
Yeah.
I was so angry at how poorly, and I remain this way, to be honest, how poorly we managed in the U.S. And so my anger is primarily directed at one idiot who was our president at the time, who did such a horrible job that he could have been a hero if he'd helped manage this well. And instead, he's the great villain for me. And many of us who have watched family losses during this time period. So that's that's probably the pieces of this that will remain for me. There's lots of other things, right? But when you ask me what will be the standout, and that's going to be my standout. And I know for many people that the losses they've experienced and the losses that we have all collaboratively experienced during this time period, they're devastating. And there's no other word for it than that when you lose people you love and care about. And there's been far too many, far too soon over the last year. So yeah, that's what will stand out for me.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry for your loss. I really am, but thank you for sharing it so generously, and you've to think it through, I guess, with us, to share it and to understand. I think that's the aim, isn't it, as cognitive psychologists, to try to make meaning. That's what we try to do, and it's hard in this right at the moment to understand what meaning there is to be had. But thank you for sharing it with us. I really appreciate it, and thank you for talking through all those questions and sharing your insights about it and the work that you do. I think we've got a lot of work ahead of us to understand about memory and what's going on, but I think it's good work, and hopefully work we get to keep doing together.
We'll keep at it for a while here. Thank you, Amanda. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and we'll talk again soon.